Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be reacting to, we're going to be reacting to this video called How the US Stole the Philippines. Well, as a Filipino, I have an idea on how things happen, but I recently found out that a lot of things here in the US, or basically parts of the history of the US dealing with another country, is not on their textbook and not being taught in school here in the US. They are surprised that a lot of people are surprised that the Philippines used to be a colony of the US, something like that. So it's interesting, and I invited an American friend to react to this video with me because pretty sure he didn't know the history of the US in the Philippines and all of that, because based on my conversations with him, like I said, a lot of things are not included in their textbook and their curriculums in this country. So it's interesting for you to learn history of your country in another country, like my country.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happened in U.S. history that it depends on your schooling, obviously, but it's not always that they don't cover it at all. It's just there's obviously areas they focus on more that are more important to U.S. history than necessarily U.S.'s involvement in other countries like the Philippines. It's not that they don't necessarily ever cover that. It's just it's not the main important things that, say, as an American citizen, you need to know about U.S. history.
Yeah.
I mean, the Revolutionary War and Civil War and probably a little bit more important to U.S. People in the U.S. than some of the other things. But I mean, obviously, you hear about probably some other. Technically, they're not even wars because of the U.S. didn't even declare war. Like Vietnam, you probably know about Vietnam more than the Philippines or the Korean War.
But now, are you excited to learn this part of your country's history? I'm not gonna say it's based on the perspective of another country, but because obviously the guy reporting this video, or the guy making the video, is an American citizen, but he did an extensive research, and I believe he, how can I say, research on the.
So I've seen some of this guy's video. What is his channel called? Johnny Harris.
Yeah, I believe he used to do Vox News as well back then. I feel like I've seen him in Vox or something.
But he does a lot of in-depth videos, and does a lot of research.
Yeah, his channel is good. Hopefully you guys can check his channel out because it's very educational. That's why. And let's get to the video.
There is a cluster of 7,000 islands that looks like one of the most beautiful places on Earth. People have been living here for over 30,000 years, traveling between these islands, trading with each other and with the region, and developing religion, identity, and culture. It eventually became a country called Ma'i. And while all of these advancements were happening here on these islands, another group of humans had been evolving.
I did not know the name was Ma'i
over here in Europe. But this other group had a different culture, a different religion. Many of their advancements were achieved through expansion, not collaboration. And their religion thrived when they stomped out others. They wanted to conquer. These people, this culture would soon be swallowed, stripped of what made them them. And soon their name would be changed, after the name of the king of their conquerors. This isn't a story just about a big, powerful military taking over new lands. We know that story pretty well. The story of these people offers a new perspective to anyone who will listen. It's a perspective that has been wiped from our history books because of the inherent discomfort and tension with this fact that the United States, once a colony that heroically threw off an empire to become independent, soon became an empire itself. It contradicts our founding belief that it is, quote, self-evident that all men are created equal. And this story isn't just history. That empire still exists today, with colonial possessions and subjects. It's all wrapped up in the story of these 7,000 islands and their people. So, I want to tell you the story of how the US stole the Philippines.
There are still American citizens today who do not have equal voting rights. These are citizens of America's island territories.
The U.S. Constitution grants citizenship to everyone born on U.S. soil except in one jurisdiction.
You need to sell the war to the American people. So the angle on this war was liberation. We were liberating the people.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
No. That's later. We're talking about 1898. But yes, the whole idea of selling war to the American public didn't really go away after this. Why did the US go to war in Iraq?
We're in the early stages of military operations.
So anyway, the US is now at war with Spain, which is an empire that is deeply in decline, as I mentioned. It's not going to be hard to win. But soon, it's not just Cuba. The US, really meaning Teddy Roosevelt, who again is just an assistant secretary of the Navy. He's like not a big decision maker. He somehow maneuvers the situation to say like, let's liberate next door Puerto Rico. And while we're at it, let's go into the Pacific and liberate Guam and the Philippines from Spain as well. Teddy didn't even ask his boss to do this. He literally sent off a cable to the Navy commander in Asia that was like, George Dewey, go attack the Philippines where Spain is. That is what your mandate is. And George Dewey's like, okay, I'm being told to go to war with Spain and the Philippines. Teddy was sort of the mind like better to ask forgiveness than permission. I mean, I get that, but kind of nuts that he pulled it off. Anyway, and now because of Teddy Roosevelt, who we literally named the teddy bear after, side note, we are at war not in the Caribbean only, but also in the Pacific. The US arrives to the Philippines and sees that the locals had already been fighting against the Spanish for like years. The Spanish were weak and were totally declining. So it's like the top of the ninth inning or like the fourth quarter of the Spanish in the Philippines. And the US shows up and is like, let us liberate you. And the Philippines were like, well, we've sort of already been fighting this bloody war for years against the Spanish. So yeah, I guess United States, if you want to come help us deal the final blow to Spain, like sweet. So George Dewey, this Navy commander, and his fleet show up to Manila. Meanwhile, back in the US, people are like, wait, weren't we just supposed to invade Cuba? What are we doing in the Philippines now? And the US government's like, because the Philippines is a perfect hub for commercial opportunities in Asia, and we think that if we don't take it, Japan or Germany might take it, which would clearly diminish our geostrategic advantage in the Pacific. No, they didn't say that. They said, we want to liberate the people of the Philippines.
Liberate. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
So the Spanish see the US arrive to the Philippines and they're like, great, we're done. So the Spanish military commanders ask to meet with the US military commanders. They meet in secret and Spain's like, listen, I know we're losing, but we really want to save some face here. We don't want it to look like we lost to the Filipino revolutionaries. And I'm not kidding. The Spanish commander literally said that he would, quote, be willing to surrender to white people, but not to the Filipinos. So
Yeah,
the
I
US
heard that.
commanders
They
are
teach
like,
that
"Oh,
in our
there's an
school."
opportunity here. We said we were here to liberate the Filipinos, but we haven't promised anything yet. So we would much rather
You're
it
gonna
look
say
like the US
technically,
defeated Spain instead of
Technically, we
help
did.
the Filipinos defeat Spain. Much better for our brand, says the United States. So together, the United States and Spanish militaries organize a fake battle. A fake battle in which the US
Really?
would fight the Spanish in Manila, and the Spanish would intentionally lose. And the climax of this whole theatrical battle, according to the plan, was that at the end, the US would storm towards the inner walled city of Manila, the last stronghold of where the Spanish are. Oh, and the key detail in this whole plan, they would not let the Filipino fighters, the ones that had been doing all the actual fighting against the Spanish, join them as they stormed
Yeah, it's
towards
true.
the walled city to
It's
deal
true.
the final blows to the Spanish Empire. And this would mean that the Filipinos technically didn't gain their independence. It was actually the US who conquered the Spanish. And then the Spanish were like, oh, can you give us $20 million for our troubles? And the US was like, yeah, sure. So now the US wins the war and they claim sovereignty over the Philippines. So yeah, this happened. They did the fake battle, they won the war. And instead of liberating the Filipinos, they just say, hey, we're your new colonizers. Psych. Meanwhile, back in the United States, they got to keep up this white savior liberation narrative that they created to justify going to war with Spain. So you see a lot more theatrical PR by the government. They staged this giant military parade in New York City, where this military commander who did the fake war, George Dewey, marches down. They called it Dewey Day. It was like a 2-day parade in New York City. They created a big military arch for him. He became like a military hero for having liberated all these people from the Spanish. And then you start to see these crazy advertisements, like this soap advertisement that has George Dewey, the commander, washing his hands with the caption, quote, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness."
Cleanliness. Skin whitening.
And on the side, you have soap being offloaded in the Philippines and being given to the locals. The US had to frame this not as conquest, but as the honorable duty of the US to civilize these people, or in the words of the soap ad, quote, "to brighten the dark corners of the earth."
The dark corners of the earth.
This is insane.
Whiten your skin.
Okay, so this is where things really heat up. It's 1900 now. Spain loses the war, obviously, and the US now
So you're going to
owns
say that's
Puerto
where
Rico,
you got the idea
Guam,
for
and
your
they claim
skin
the
whitening
Philippines.
products?
But the local Filipinos who've
Says
been fighting for
over
their
soap
freedom
and
for
saying,
years
"Whiten
are
your
like,
skin
no,
with
no, no,
this."
no, no. You just waltzed in here on our rebellion and conspired with the Spanish to make it look like you were liberating us. No, this is our country. We don't need another colonizer. And this is where things really heat up. The Filipinos start fighting again for their independence, and this time against the United States. It is a pretty horrible, bloody war, one that I never learned about in school. It includes massacres of men, women, and children by the United States, and hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. But the US eventually won, and they established a government in the Philippines. Back in the US, the appetite for expansion continued to go down and people sort of just forgot about the Philippines. They forgot that there was a war there. One newspaper summed it up by saying, Americans didn't know if the Philippines were islands or canned fruit. But the fact remained that the US went to war and now owned the Philippines in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam. So this begged a very important question, one that hadn't been asked before, which is all of this land America? Are these people Americans? This was a huge question. And the answer to that question affects how we see these territories still today. Okay, so a few years after these wars, there's a guy in New York City who's importing oranges from one of these territories, Puerto Rico. And he's paying tariffs on these imports because, you know, that's what you do when you're importing oranges from another country. Wait a minute, another country? This guy was like, didn't we conquer Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines? Isn't that America? The Constitution says that you can't put tariffs on stuff coming from other parts of the US. Like New Jersey can't put tariffs on avocados from California. So he sued, and his case and a bunch of others like it made it to the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court must decide, is this land where we just won a war, is this America? Are these Americans? If they are, do they get all the same rights as other Americans? Do they get to vote? Do they get to participate in the US economy without tariffs, like any other state does? And honestly, this isn't a question about oranges and tariffs. The real question at stake here is America the land of the free where all are created equal? Or are we an empire? No different than any other empire that scoops up colonial possessions in war and rules the people, who are usually black and brown, as subjects, not fully a part of the country. That was the question that was at stake. And in this series of cases in the early 1900s, the Supreme Court decided that America was the latter, is the latter. They created a new category of land called unincorporated territories, where the people don't have any representation in the democracy, but where Congress could create laws on their own, particularly laws dealing with revenue, which would not be allowed by the Constitution for states within the Union. We can create revenue laws, stuff that's totally unconstitutional for other parts of our country. In other words, unincorporated territories are land we control and exploit for revenue, but whose people don't get to vote and don't get the right to trial by jury. So yeah, the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam, remained unincorporated territories, a place that the US could kind of just ignore without a lot of consequence. They weren't important enough or strategic enough to be considered to become states like Hawaii or Alaska. So they sort of faded from American consciousness. Like, this is why we never heard about this in school. Like, it didn't make it into the history books in any salient way. And how far the Philippines had faded from people's minds became very clear in December of 1941, during World War II. The US had owned the Philippines for like 40 years, when a fleet of Japanese bombers flew across the Pacific and bombed an American naval base in Hawaii.
And the severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
But what we don't really remember is on that day, Japan bombed Guam and the Philippines, 2 American territories, as well as several other American and British territories.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Here's the draft of this speech. This is the original draft that FDR spent the day marking up before he gave it. Zoom in a little bit and you'll see on this draft that it mentioned the Philippines originally, but FDR crossed it out. He crossed out the mention of Manila. Yes, the Philippines was on some map somewhere. Yes, we technically owned it. But the people really didn't want to hear about it because these people weren't Americans. The Supreme Court had to say
Americans.
they weren't going to become states anytime soon. So why mention them? After that day, Japan actually full-on invaded the Philippines. They didn't do that to Hawaii, but they did to the Philippines until the end of the war, at which point the Philippines were finally granted independence in 1946. Fast forward to today, and this "we own you, but you're not really Americans" precedent established by the Supreme Court still applies to 4 million people who live in unincorporated territories. Or let's just call it a spade. Let's call them what they are. These are colonial possessions. The people who live here don't experience the full rule of law. They don't get trial by jury. They don't have full representation in our democracy. And they don't get to vote for the president. This is why when a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, the government response is not nearly what it should be. The way Trump talked about Puerto Rico as almost another country, as not a part of us, mirrors exactly how the Supreme Court talked about these unincorporated territories. They're for revenue, not to compete with American farmers. We conquered these places, but we didn't want to bring the people fully into the American project. We left them out. And there they remain today.
What do you think of it?
It's interesting. Because I, of course, had heard about unincorporated territories before, but I mean, it was interesting to hear a little bit more about that. Because I did hear, I think maybe in a different YouTube video, the history of, like, you know, the Spain taking over the Philippines, and then the U.S. Taking over from the Spanish. I didn't know about that sort of backhanded deal between the U.S. and Spain.
Yeah, because they don't want to lose to non-white people, so they'd rather lose to like an American who's
And
white.
yeah, that puts a different sort of spin on it that makes the Spanish and the U.S. not look very good. And I knew about in World War II, the Japanese. This was the first time hearing about. I think I probably have heard about, like, the Pearl Harbor not being the only place that was attacked, and just as a general historical thing, that is sort of blown up a little bit out of proportion. It's just going back from the how they blew it up in proportion in order to get the U.S. into World War II in the first place.
Yeah.
Because Pearl Harbor was, they made, you know, when they talk about this day will live in infamy, and they make it sound like the Japanese, just bomb New York City, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pearl Harbor, it's a military base or a naval base or whatever. It's not great that it was happening, but that was Japan was attacking the U.S. To start, basically a war. That's what happens in war, and it's not great. But at the same time, it's not like they did. I don't know. I don't think you would count that as a war crime necessarily.
Mm-hmm. But now you understand. Remember, because basically you went to the Philippines before with me and had a vacation in there in Manila. And you noticed like a lot of stores are like selling all these skin whitening products, and you're surprised by it. Now you understand like one of our obsession with skin whitening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're like, yeah, we got colonized by Spain for 300 years, and a lot of them are white, and then the Americans came, and especially this guy, what's his name, Dewey? Dewey?
Yeah.
Bringing soap with us, and like, we're civilizing the dark corners of the the way they package it, like we're cleaning the dark corners of the mm-hmm. Like melanin is something bad or something. I don't know. That's funny. But yeah. Well, what do you think of the phrase the government used to justify their conquest, to liberate all these people, these savages? I feel like they use the word liberate in a different context.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is like sort of a long time ago.
Well, not just that. Is that the reason why our troops are in Afghanistan? Because we wanted to liberate the people of Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, you can compare it. I mean, obviously that's what this video was doing. It was comparing our invasion of Afghanistan to this, because obviously there was more to invading Afghanistan than just liberating the people. Mm-hmm. And the same thing applies to Iraq and other places we've gone to.
Mm-hmm. But as you can see in this video, like they use the word liberate in a very different way. Like what they mean by liberate is like we're conquering these people. Basically, we're freeing them from their other oppressors, and we're gonna be the new oppressor. Basically, that's what they mean by liberate. We will liberate them from them, but not from us, kind of way. That's why. But as you can see, like the guy said so himself, that this is not taught in school. They never teach this in your school. So are you surprised with all the information you found out?
Not really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like I said, it's not that you don't learn any of it. It's just, I mean, well, it depends also how interested you are in history as a subject, how much you pay attention.
Well, for me, I'm interested in
and I mean, this is definitely something you would probably cover in a college course, but yes, in like elementary, you're probably not going to touch any of this. High school, maybe, but not that much. And also, it depends on where you are and how good your school is.
So, who's the two presidents you mentioned in this video? Roosevelt, and who's the other one?
The president
before him. McKinley.
McKinley, I think.
McKinley. Are they Republicans or Democrat or something? If I may ask, I don't really know.
Teddy Roosevelt is Republican. I would maybe assume that McKinley. Is that his name? William McKinley. I would probably assume he's a Republican if Teddy Roosevelt was in his administration, but I don't actually know that.
So does it change the way you look at the Republicans and the Democrats now?
Well,
because of this information?
No, not really, because you have to keep in mind that this is like around 1900, right? This is the Republican and Democratic parties are not the same back then as they are today. I mean, they're almost completely different parties. So it's not really quite fair to compare them.
How do you think your parents would react to this information? To all this information, and like, I'm pretty sure like I don't know McKinley and Roosevelt that way, but I'm pretty sure they were loved by a lot of people.
Well, McKinley
peop-
probably not as much as Teddy Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you'll notice Teddy Roosevelt is on Mount Rushmore.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you ask a fair amount of people who William McKinley is, they'll just look at you and say, "Who?"
Mm-hmm.
And not exactly a remembered president.
Mm. Well, yeah, I noticed like a lot of people in the US don't know their history that well. Well, even if they do, like based on what I saw and like I observe in here, like a lot of things are like removed from history or something like that. It's like they don't want to talk about it. Like as you can see, they didn't even mention the Philippines or anything during the war when they talk about the war, something like that. Yes, I don't know. I feel like they only choose like what they want to incorporate in like the history book for like people to learn instead of like putting everything out there so everybody's aware of like what happened. And especially now you found out like what happened on, how can I say, on our point of view, on how we see things in our lenses basically, because it's easier for you to, or not just you, but like the US to say this and that. They make it sound like it's this way and that way, but let's talk about the people who got, should I say, colonized or like who got invaded. How do they view things basically? And now at least you understand like both sides of the scenario, I guess.
And then the other thing is like obviously from an American perspective, like when you're talking about education, it depends on like how much you go into it, because like talking about like the war that he was talking about in this video, it probably is mentioned in most people's education, but you probably don't remember it because it was just mentioned very briefly as the Spanish-American War of 1898. And then maybe you talk a little bit about it and then you move on. Like it's not necessarily always that things are never talked about. It's just like, unless you go into depth of it, you're not necessarily going to remember much about it. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of wars in America's history. I don't know how many. If you go up to people, most people are probably not going to know what you're talking about if you ask them about the Spanish-American War of 1898.
But now at least especially with what's happening in the news right now, so do you have a different perspective of Afghanistan now? Like I know it's not related to this video, but like it's happening right, like during the time we're recording this video, like the US is like moving out of Afghanistan. But I remember like we went to Afghanistan and like pretty sure, I'm not gonna be surprised if they use the same phrase like the way they use it in here, like we're gonna liberate the people of Afghanistan. But do they really want to be liberated or anything like that? Or it's just the, because as you said, they're trying to sell war.
Yeah, well, I think,
trying to make money.
You could take the evidence of the amount of people who want to get out of Afghanistan, that yes, there were people who did want to be didn't want the Taliban to be in control. And so when we drove the Taliban out, they appreciated that. But the problem is, if we weren't going to stay there, it maybe wasn't the best thing to try to start meddling in other people's politics, because obviously the work that the US did to try to set up a government and have them run everything did not really work out. Because we set up, forces and gave them weapons, and now those weapons are in the hands of the Taliban.
But anyway, so do you find this video educational?
Yeah.
Would you recommend it to like any of your friends, American friends, so they become aware of like history of this country as well, of this country to another country? And besides, well, are you gonna have a different point of view of the Philippines once you visit the Philippines again?
Not really.
Not really. Not different point of view, like at least you're gonna understand them more and like the history of the place, like you have more understanding of like the history of people and like why people do certain things. Anyway, especially the skin whitening part. that you purchased one of their soap, the soap in Philippines. Well, I purchased it and I let him try it. Skin whitening, even though he's already white, but just to give him like, you know, smoothen the dark corners of his earth. But anyway, hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Don't forget to give it a like, a share, and subscribe. And please be kind in the comment section. And I'll see you guys in my future video.